Hi, thanks for joining us for more Uncommon Sense from the Sociological Review Foundation. I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney, Australia.
And I'm Alexis Hutrong in Gatineau City, Ottawa, Canada.
Now, we often start the show by saying that by casting a critical sociological eye on everyday notions and understandings, it's our hope that Uncommon Sense can help us think about living together and confronting our shared crises. Today, we're going to be putting that claim to the test because we're talking about Ukraine.
Yeah, and with us today is Volodymyr Ishchenko, a Ukrainian sociologist based at the Institute of East European Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. His opinion pieces, essays, and interviews are collected in his book Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War.
Volodymyr's interested in things like protests, social movements, right and left politics, nationalism, civil society, and today's theme, revolution. And crucially, his work, and this is a key point for us today, is about Ukraine, but not only about Ukraine, or for people who study it, because Ukraine, as he shows, is a site where global processes are playing out, and its story is instructive, indeed probably cautionary for all of us.
Volodymyr, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So Rosie mentioned that you work on revolution. So could you tell us a bit like what that entails? I guess I'm interested because like revolution is such a huge word, right? It quickly conjures up a lot of powerful imagery.
I think, it is actually like a big concept that many people might contest, and it's a question what revolutions mean today. And the word revolution, I think in the most interesting meaning, also publicly interesting, not just academically interesting, it contains two things. That the radical and relatively fundamental changes in society, economy, politics, on the one hand, but on the other hand, these are changes that are brought by the collective action from below, by the popular mobilization. And these are two interrelated and very much important elements of this concept. We need fundamental change, but at the same time, this change should be brought by us, the mobilized people who are mobilized not just for one event, but also continue this mobilization, this collective action from below in the long process of revolution.
I use social movement theory a lot in my work, and I really appreciate the way you just spoke about revolutions there, because I know obviously, revolutions and social movements are kind of different things per se, but I think there's some shared interests here, like, how people mobilize for change, why people mobilize for change, but also, as you pointed out, sometimes like why it might fail as well. And I think it's interesting, Ukraine has seen a lot of events that have been described as revolutions in recent decades. So 3 from 1990 to 2014. And there's a timeline you can find, which goes a little something like this. So in 1989 and 1990, there's a youth uprising against the USSR. And in 1991, Ukraine becomes independent. Then jump ahead to 2004, where there's the Orange Revolution. This is where protests against an election that is understood to be rigged and was meant to give power to a pro-Russian, Viktor Yanukovych, led to victory for the pro-Western, Viktor Ischenko. As a sidebar, Yanukovych does come back in 2010. And then in 2014, you have Euromaidan. And I'll quote the Open Society Foundation, the OSF, which describes these protests as more than a demand for closer EU relations. They were a rejection of injustice as a way of life and of the post-Soviet politics of corruption and nepotism. Civil society activists and NGOs, it continues, played an important role. So there's this huge violent crackdown from the government, which was eventually replaced by a government led by pro-Western oligarch Petro Poroshenko. Okay, so that timeline, it's got omissions, definitely. It's something that we're going to flesh out and add to today, challenging some of the simplifications that I've probably just made and so on, not from a political standpoint, but from a sociological one. So how does your work complicate the narrative of Euromaidan in terms of its social makeup? Who got involved? What interests were at play? I'm just curious about the social mix of the protesters.
Well, that's something that have been actually discussed not only in relation to Maidan, but to the relation to the contemporary revolutions that often claimed to be brought by very diverse crowds of people who gather at the streets and the squares of the cities, and this way they overthrow the government. So the attention to this diversity of the makeup is pretty common. And that argument have been made in relation to Ukraine's Euromaidan, that this is a broad, popular revolution where representatives of each group from Ukrainian society came together and made some political change. The problem is that, yes, very diverse people participate in this kind of revolutions, but they participate in different extent and have different impact and influence. And in case of Ukraine, indeed, there were some people, for example, from the southern or eastern parts of the country, but they were less numerous than the people who were coming from western and central regions, well, significantly less. That's one of the asymmetries in the participation. The other asymmetries are actually what political agents, which social groups had more impact. One of the important groups, which I studied quite a lot, were the radical nationalists. And I've been shown that they actually were the most active collective agent in Euromaidan protests, specifically in the violent part of those protests, but also in non-violent, the far-right party Svoboda, which means freedom in Ukraine, but which is actually an ethno-nationalist, quite radical far-right party. And they were not actually popular in electoral terms, but that's not exactly the only way how politics is made, especially in the countries like Ukraine with much more contentious, much more volatile politics, where the outcomes of the elections does not necessarily mean that the will of the people is going to be pursued, and rather it has been typically the opposite. And the way to influence politics via mobilization, also via violence, have been much more important than, let's say, in established democracies. So radical nationalists who became empowered, who became more integrated in the military police structures, who were capable to push forward their ideological agenda. Also the pro-Western NGOs, very often funded by different Western donors. The whole sphere of the civil society have been supported by Western institutions, which created certain resources, obviously, but also certain dependencies and also certain asymmetries. And not necessarily, even though they were claiming to be Ukrainian civil society, they were not necessarily representing the interest of the Ukrainian society, right? In the typical notion about what civil society is supposed to be, kind of like a public representation of some social groups. And the actual policies, actual ideologies of the NGOized civil society have been in many aspects quite different from what the majority of the Ukrainian society would prefer, so in particular in the neoliberal reforms. And also another important group, some of the Ukrainian oligarchs that have been actually mentioned. Petro Poroshenko, he can be displayed as a pro-Western oligarch, but he's actually one of the manifestations of how extremely opportunistic these people may be. So his entering into Ukrainian politics in the 1990s started from the what is commonly known as a pro-Russian camp. He was one of the founders of the party which was actually overthrown in 2014. Plus, the final thing are the Western powers, United States, European Union, who acquired a leverage in Ukrainian politics, also in particular thanks to the weakening of the Ukrainian state, which became more dependent on the support of the West in the war which started in Donbass, in the hostilities with Russia. The West acquired very important leverage on the Ukrainian politics.
So just by starting to look at the groups, the composition of the crowd, it allows a very deep reflection on some of the internal and also the dynamics that are external to the groups that are mobilizing. And as you've said, like the different factions involved, including Ukrainian nationalists and what you call NGOized civil society backed by the West, they also brought like different resources with them. So meaning that some were heard more and maybe represented more effectively than others. And so I'm wondering, like, was the outcome of Euromaidan revolutionary in the conventional common sense way people might understand from a term like revolution? Was it a radical type of transformation or not quite?
That's one of the biggest questions about the contemporary revolutions, not just about Euromaidan. So what are those radical transformations that may come out of these revolutions? Mm-hmm. So apparently not anything like we've seen after, let's say, classical social revolutions, the French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution of 1917, or the Chinese Revolution of 1949, where the basic structures of economy have been changed, where the classes have been changed. Some classes were actually almost eradicated from the economic structure, and they lost political influence. That's what happened, for example, after the Russian Revolution. And very different political regimes emerged, and much stronger, much bigger states emerge, which have much more expansive power. And they become also more efficient in terms of tax collection, in terms of the modernization, in terms of the regulation of economy. Economy, in many cases, they experience decline, in particular because this kind of revolution bring quite devastating civil wars. But then we've seen quite astonishing modernization processes, which in particular happened in the Soviet Union. Now, the question is something like this happening now? No. But on the other hand, does it mean that there are no consequences at all? I also think that that would be a big simplification, although, there are scholars, for example, who say that these revolutions are simply overthrowing the governments. Other scholars simply call these contemporary revolutions as not revolutionary at all. Why we are even speaking about them as revolutions when, in Ukrainian case, there is a narrative that presents Euromaidan as a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat made by radical nationalists, by violence, and also with support of the West. It points to some important parts of the reality, but I also think it's not entirely explaining what's happening. Because if we look at them as simply a coup d'etat, what is the role of the people? The issue is that this popular mobilization, this revolutionary form, something that the contemporary revolutions actually share with the social revolutions, with that type of politics that emerged, as a famous sociologist Sewell actually argued, that revolutionary form emerged in the French Revolution in 1789, when the people mobilized the street and claimed their sovereign power against the king. And that kind of revolutionary form is reproducing up until now. The people come to the streets and claim their sovereign power against the government they don't think to represent themselves. And it does have consequences for legitimation of some of the outcomes, which may not actually represent the interest of those people, but which acquire legitimacy as outcomes of these revolutions. Something that, small groups of radical nationalists push forward and claim legitimacy of the whole people. Some neoliberal reforms which benefit just very narrow part of the society are pushed forward by the pro-Western NGOs, and they claim to be the continuation of the Euromaidan. So, in fact, this combination of, let's say, counter-hegemonic weakness, let's use this term, the weakness of the popular organization of the dominated classes, combined with the revolutionary form, produce a specific set of outcomes which do not bring revolutionary transformation in the sense of the classical social revolutions, but they do produce important, significant outcomes. And in case of Ukraine, this was in particular polarization along ethnicized lines, and also asymmetrical amplification in political sense of the specific social groups, and which acquire asymmetrical power to push forward their agendas and their interests.
Yeah, so, you point out that the aftermath of Euromaidan was kind of hardly revolutionary. So there's been no wholesale transformation of the state or society, with the aspirations of those who took part also not mapping neatly onto what came afterwards. And you've brought up sort of some other examples to show that this isn't a process that's really specific to Ukraine necessarily. I know you use this term deficient revolutions. Is this what you're explaining to us here? Can you tell us your thinking around the term deficient revolutions?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the actually the process that we try to catch with this concept. So the revolutions happened. The people overthrow the government. But then we do not see those rapid fundamental social and political changes. Why? One answer, this was not a revolution at all. This was a simply regime breakdown, some scholars claim. Coup d'etat, some people invent the term coupvolution, right? So if it's not a revolution, we do not even expect those changes. But, well, does that revolutionary form matter? Not at all. It does matter, I think. Another answer is that maybe revolution simply evolved. So we have kind of like evolution of revolutions. We do not even need to expect the revolutionary changes after the contemporary revolutions, right? And that actually take away some of the most interesting part of why people are interested in revolutions. It's not just popular mobilization, but also the expectation that this mobilization is bringing fundamental social and political change. And when it doesn't happen, one answer would be, well, we simply need to wait more. And some scholars also think about it as maybe these are liberal democratic revolutions, but eventually, simply by opening some space for civil society, they would produce some long-term liberal democratic outcomes. This is what in sociology and social sciences is typically criticized as teleological vision. Yeah. So there is some goal, and we expect and we construct the whole narrative oriented towards that goal, which may not actually necessarily happen. And when we do not see those outcomes, in case of Ukraine, we actually, as we've been spoken, we have revolution since 1990. Let's say over 3 decades of revolutions. And the result is devastating war. So my answer is, what if these are deficient revolutions, not failed revolutions, not aborted revolutions, but revolutions that produce deficient outcomes? And we need to accept this reality. These revolutions do have outcomes. This is, in particular, polarization. All revolutions polarize the society. But social revolutions polarize them across the class lines. Workers against capital. The contemporary revolutions tend to polarize the society across non-class lines. In case of Ukraine, these were ethnicized lines. Lines across the regions, and also more and more connected to the question of Ukrainian versus Russian, Ukrainian language versus Russian language. And the revolutions didn't start as ethnic conflict. But the more the process evolves, the more of the ethnic dimensions we got there. Another outcome is this asymmetrical amplification. This is what we've seen studying Ukraine's Euromaidan. We see not the construction of the strongest state, more equal society, but rather the continuation of the crisis which those revolutions were responding to in the first place.
I have this feeling of like, oh, I want to find who's at fault for the phenomenon of like this deficient revolution. But, I know like fault's not a very sociological word, but it feels like the way that you're explaining this is this really interesting bridge across these two strands of the theory that I'm used to using with social movement theory, right? Which is, you have the social movement theorists who take the sort of Marxist historicist analysis, and they're interested in kind of the fault lines in society that give rise to mobilization. And then you have the kind of organizational people who are looking at how groups are kind of mobilizing amongst themselves and how what they're doing. And I like how your explanation is sort of marrying these two. And am I right? I know you've mentioned this word previously. Am I right that you talk about all of this in terms of hegemony, which I'd describe as imperfectly, the dominance of a state usually over like the social, economic, political world. And you've talked about this, a crisis of hegemony. Can you explain that? Like what's the crisis people are facing here, not just in Ukraine, but beyond?
Yeah, that's hegemony is probably even more contested term than the revolutions. And I base on one of the most known theorists of hegemony, Antonio Gramsci. And there is also no consensual interpretation of what Gramsci meant by hegemony. But what I'm talking about, and that also follows the interpretation of one of the very interesting American sociologist, Dylan Riley. He is a professor at the University of Berkeley. That hegemony, in fact, describes the process of mutual political growth of antagonistic social classes. Let's say 19th century, the workers against the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie is becoming more conscious, more organized. At the same time, it also creates opportunities and creates the impulses for the workers to become also better organized. So the workers are starting to create the mutual help societies, unions, eventually parties, socialist parties, communist parties, finally. In Russia, they make a revolution, which inspired Gramsci so much. The Soviet Union becomes kind of like a counter-hegemonic pole for the whole world. At the same time, the United States becomes a hegemonic pole for the, let's say, bourgeois world. And we see the process of the mutually amplified political growth of the social classes. The politics becomes more and more complicated, more organized, more articulated, more conscious. Very developed ideologies developed. Communism, based on Marxism, was a huge social theory. The bourgeoisie is capable to claim that they do represent the universal class, the universal interests, and this is the interest institutionalized in the state. So hegemony is actually fundamentally explains the stability of power of the ruling class despite the growing threat of a revolution, right? Then what is crisis of hegemony? I would also describe it as a very broad process that started, let's say, end of 60s, 1970s. And it could also be thought about in the global framework. It's basically the opposite process of political fragmentation. The political parties have become fragmented. They start to quarrel with each other. The parties which organize the political structures of the major countries, they become less and less popular. They involve less and less people. The ideologies become shallow. The articulation of the class interests become not convincing at all. And more people experience what is, in simpler words, is described as the crisis of political representation. The ruling elite does not represent our interests. Whichever party we vote, it doesn't change anything. So this is kind of like shallowness of politics, right? There is a political struggle. The elections happen. There is some competition. So Labour, for example, competes with the Tories in the Great Britain. In Germany, for example, the political structure is more or less stable. So still Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, although other parties are emerging, like the far-right Alternative for Germany. And when we get into this crisis of politics, one of the manifestations is what is typically described as populism, the articulation of the peoples against the elites, the emergence of the so-called anti-establishment, anti-systemic parties. But even when they come to power, For example, as in Greece in 2015, Syriza, the coalition of radical left, they typically not capable to push forward those expectations and aspirations that were put in them by their voters. And so this is hegemony crisis.
Mhm.
And we may think about deficient revolutions as actually one of the fundamental processes that escalates this crisis. People want their say. They can overthrow the governments, but they cannot bring forward the change that would represent their interests.
You mentioned these complex ideas like sort of representation, interests, like elites, and so on. And as you've said, Ukrainian politics have recently been spoken of in terms of so-called ethnic and national identity. But you highlight, right, the importance of class and geography as key factors in Ukrainian politics. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that. How do you approach these reflections?
So why class? Actually, geography in terms of the regional cleavage in Ukraine, that's been actually quite typical topic also in relation to Euromaidan. The question is how exactly we understand that regional cleavage, which did manifested in the polarized elections, for example, in the 1990s, in the 2000s, up until, let's say, 2019, when Zelensky supposedly united Ukraine, but that's also quite doubtful right now. So we do see very polarized maps. Western Ukraine votes for some parties and candidates. Eastern Ukraine votes for other candidates and parties. How do we understand it? Well, the region itself does not explain, right? So is it some history? Is it some identity? What is it exactly? This cleavage also manifested in Euromaidan, as I mentioned. And one answer is that basically connects it to ethno-linguistic conflict. So the Western Ukraine is more Ukrainian speaking, is more, let's say, pro-Western in terms of geopolitical orientation, is more anti-communist in terms of the relation to the legacy of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Ukraine is the opposite. So the region becomes basically kind of like a proxy for something like ethnicized conflict. And the people then, the scholars then measure the correlations of different variables that may point to some of the underlying quasi-ethnic conflict. But it is also very much contested. And one of the problems is, if it's simply kind of like ethnic conflict, why is so much asymmetry between them? Why is that Western part is so consistently winning on the streets? But at the same time, the Eastern part is winning elections, at least, again, until 2014. That's a puzzle. Why the Eastern part is much less mobilized? And very typically, some sociologists, political scientists basically make this post-colonial argument. This is national building, right? What is used to be think as a eastern part of the regional cleavage is simply legacy of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union. And it doesn't have any future. And the Western Ukraine is basically becomes kind of like an embryo for Ukraine properly. This is, Ukraine growing, expanding. This is a popular narrative, but also teleological.
Yeah.
It's a very typical teleological nation-building story, which we also know is very much problematic in many other parts of the world. And so my answer about class is a way to explain that asymmetry, that real asymmetry of the post-Soviet Ukrainian politics. What we may think about the regional cleavage may be actually a national-specific manifestation of the class conflict, which started to be structured in the process of the Soviet Union collapse, when the former communist elite were starting to become political capitalists. Capitalists whose major competitive advantage is their special privilege connection to the state. And on the other side of this class conflict is the professional middle class excluded from political capitalism, but which finds alliance with the transnational capital, typically represented by the Western powers. And this asymmetrical class cleavage, because the professional middle class, who is actually the most important social base for the civil society, for the organization of the public sphere, is so much skewed to, let's say, Western part of the politics. We see this asymmetrical development of the mobilization and elections. Political capitals can rely on the passive voters who are dependent on them in terms of the paternalistic organization of production in the Romanian big Soviet factories, which were important until the devastating war in Ukraine. But they cannot mobilize them actively. Well, the civil society is so much skewed to the other part of the supposedly regional cleavage. Mm. And when we look at the class, we start to understand the asymmetries which have so much manifested in Euromaidan and in post-Euromaidan politics.
In the middle of a conflict, and indeed, I mean, like maybe also in the process of nation building that you've been describing, narratives, which you've mentioned, seem to simplify. And I mean, some might say they have to, right? But what benefit is there as a sociologist in drawing attention to these very complex, messy realities that you've been describing today? I'd suggest it makes people, myself included, start to think about how we can talk about and define Ukraine as something more than simply not Russia, yeah? And also as a site, again, as I think you've been drawing out here, where global processes are playing out and where globally relevant lessons are right there to be learned, or, you know, something. Does that seem right to you?
That's a very important point, and I've been trying to make it. It's not complication just for the sake of complication. We as social scientists, I think that's basically our task, to question this supposedly natural ethnicization of conflict, that's supposedly natural hatred. And when we look at in Ukraine, and when we look, for example, at that decolonization agenda, which maybe some of the listeners or some of the scholars could also notice, that, Ukraine is supposedly undergoing the process of decolonization and removing the remains of the Russian legacy. And why is it happening? Oh, it's because of the war. No, it's not simply because of the war. In a way, it is related to the war, but not in a way in the sense of the cause, but in the sense of, let's say, a trigger, an opportunity. The war allows certain criticism to be completely delegitimized. And it also opens opportunities for specific political agents, ideologies, to acquire much bigger prominence. For example, renaming the streets, removing some monuments to Russian poets and writers, Ukrainianization of the public sphere and also of the private sphere, which is experienced by a significant group of Ukrainians as coercion coming from the state. This is, for example, what is revealed in some of our interviews that we are collecting in the last half of year. This is not necessarily coming from the push from below. It is experienced as a coercion from above. So the task of the social scientist is not simply complication for the sake of complication. Right? It connects immediately to the most relevant questions, to the question, what is actually should be done during the war and after the war? Is the unity of the people is simply imagined unity, or it has something real behind it? There is some real popular push from below. And another part of the question is that decolonization, understood as basically as a nationalist identity politics, amplification of everything that is connected to Ukraine in a very specific understanding of Ukraine. Ukrainian language Ukraine, anti-communist Ukraine, anti-Soviet Ukraine, anti-Russian Ukraine, and forgetting all the other possible articulation, what Ukraine could be, bilingual Ukraine, for example. Ukraine that embraces its Soviet legacy. This very specific understanding of decolonization just simply provincialize Ukraine, simply erases the most interesting parts of what Ukraine was and could be. Erases Ukraine from being a part of the global story. And well, objectively, Ukraine as a part of the global story is the manifestation of the enormous crisis, of the abyss. And when we are experiencing this crisis on the global scale, well, this is the country where we need to learn from.
Hi, it's Alice here, producer of Uncommon Sense. Thanks for listening as we reflect on revolution with Volodymyr Ishchenko. Listening to this, I'm reminded of our show on security with Daria Krivonos from back in season 1, where we talked about what it might actually mean to stand with Ukraine, as the hashtag goes. So after this, why not catch that in our archive? And remember, you can always catch our magazine over at thesociologicalreview.org. There, you'll find the late Michael Burawoy in conversation with Nicola Benson, reflecting on public sociology today and more. And finally, our usual request at this stage, but please don't tune out your ears. If you've been over to our site, you may have seen that the Sociological Review Foundation is a charity. We're about advancing public understanding of sociology, and the importance of that task doesn't exactly look set to go away. So we want to ask if you can please consider making a contribution to help the foundation keep bringing this podcast to you. You just need to head to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense, and you'll find that link also in our show notes. And over at that site, you can make a one-off donation just for the amount of a coffee, or set up more of a repeat thing. It will directly support the making of Uncommon Sense, and it's all gratefully received. Any feedback, we're at uncommonsense@thesociologicalreview.org. Thanks for listening.
Okay, welcome back. Here's where we ask for something that's given you a bit of uncommon sense. And today, Volodymyr, we have two brothers, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who wrote science fiction in the USSR.
Okay, so who are these guys? You read them as a child, yeah? In Russian, am I right?
Yeah, in Russian. Actually, they have some Ukrainian origins, but they lived in the city of Leningrad, the city which is now called St. Petersburg. And they were writing in the Russian language. They were Jewish. They are very famous in the post-Soviet countries. Some of the most celebrated and some of the most famous sci-fi writers of the Soviet age. Although during the Soviet Union, they had quite a difficult history and in their relations with the Communist parties. Some of their novels were censored. Some of the novels were not possible to publish. They were kind of like treated with suspicion. And they acquired more fame in the late years of the Soviet Union, when it became more liberalized, and especially in the post-Soviet period. This was sci-fi, but raising the questions relevant for the Soviet Union, but also relevant universally. The questions of the progress, the question of the relation, advanced society to the society which is perceived to be less advanced. In terms of politics, actually, it's also very much connected to hegemony crisis that I'm writing about. Strugatsky started as very committed communists, and some of the earlier novels they wrote were optimistic, connected more to the technical side of the progress, so space expansion and so on and so forth. But in the 1960s, they experienced a very typical transformation, typical for the Soviet intelligentsia, who started to be very much disappointed with the Communist Party, who started to be alienated, who didn't see themselves having any opportunities within the ossifying state, which became more and more distant from the people who they claim to represent, and alienated to their private sphere, writing these novels in the as it was called for the desk, expecting that, let's say, in 10 or 20 years it would be possible to publish them finally.
Maybe as a kind of example of their relevance today, the epigraph for your book, Towards the Abyss, is from their work, The Snail on the Slope. Could you tell us about that and how they're instructive, like right now, for your thinking?
Oh, that's actually a great novel. One of the central narrative of this novel is kind of like centered around, is also one of the typical stories for their books, is the advancement, let's say, from above. So the advanced communist Earth comes to some less advanced planet where some simple people on the basically like very primitive level of society live, and they produce some experiments there. They produce some structures, and one of these communist Earthlings appears in the village of those, let's say, primitive people, and lives with them. But at the same time, he's kind of like starting to reevaluate what they've been doing on that planet, and started to be connected to. So whatever however simple those people are, however, let's say, stable and moving nowhere their life is, but this is a place he's going to defend against some external, irrational, very difficult to comprehend changes that happen on some of the background. And he sees that them as a danger to the people to whom he becomes connected, but he chooses his side. And so the epigraph which I chose for the book is about progress. But what kind of progress? And what we call the progress? And now we are in the situation when the West is in a huge crisis. And when it's less and less plausible to claim that the Western Europe and the United States represent some socially progressive side of history right now.
Yeah.
Right? And so what are we, in which place we are now? In Ukraine, in the larger Eastern European region, where our whole political narrative, at least one of the most dominant, for the last 30 years since the Soviet Union collapse, was integration with the West for the sake of our social progress.
I mean, on the theme of progress and things, I mean, I love how sociologists do tend to be interested in sci-fi. I've got a soft spot for it. I know Alexis definitely does as well. And we're going to put some of that work in our show notes today. But I mean, Volodymyr, would normally grab a pop culture tip from you as one of the last things, but we've already got that in your praise of the Strugatsky brothers. So instead, we wanted to ask you before you go, you've got a piece, Ukrainian Voices, where you call out the Western gaze on Ukraine, but also those who seek out and use Ukrainian voices in a very narrow way, claiming to amplify them and so on. And the problem is not the quantity of inclusion in panels and so on, but rather the quality.
So for those who are listening in or from post-Soviet states like Ukraine, how can people ensure that their work gets out there on their terms? What would be your advice?
I believe that the most important thing is to address global questions from the universal perspective and try to think what we can learn from Ukraine and broader post-Soviet region basically for the humanity, for the whole world. Not trying to be to claim our narrow niche as Ukrainians that needs to be represented. Well, that's just a part of the task. But we need to be represented not simply as Ukrainians, but as social scientists who has something very important to say, or as artists who produce beautiful art, or as public leaders who speak something universally relevant. And that's something that I believe have been very much underestimated in the last years. And what is still important and will be important in the discussions, not just Ukraine, but not just of our region, but what is standing in front of the world at large right now.
Volodymyr, we want to thank you for joining us today. I think we've learned a lot, and it's just been so exciting to talk to you.
Thank you so much. It was an exciting conversation.
And so that's it for another episode of Uncommon Sense. Remember to head to the sociologicalreview.org to check out not only our show notes, but our other podcasts, and also the Sociological Review magazine, including Alice's piece on the journey of this show and what it can offer, not just to listeners, but guests too.
We will be back next month with Aaron Winter talking about free speech.
Our producer is Alice Block, our sound engineer, Dave Crackles. Thanks for being with us today. Bye.
Bye.